Welcome to the deep dive. You know, when you look at the political landscape today, especially across the G7 countries, we talk a lot about polarization, about anger. But the sources we've been digging into suggest that we might be missing the forest for the trees. It's not just that things are more divided, it's that the underlying structure of politics itself seems to be fundamentally changing.
That's the core argument, yes.
Hmm.
The research really confirms we're in the middle of a profound structural transformation. We're moving away from the entire political framework that defined, well, the whole post-war world.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, to unpack that very shift. We're looking at the argument that the West has left what you could call the age of ideology and walked right into an era where identity is now the primary fuel for politics. We've got a whole stack of empirical data and analysis from 2024 and 2025 that really connects the dots here. So let's start with the basics, because that contrast is everything. When we say ideology in the 20th century sense, what are we actually talking about?
We're talking about coherent economic doctrines. These big universal projects like social democracy or, market liberalism. They were philosophical blueprints for how an entire society should be run.
A blueprint for society. Okay, so if that was the blueprint, what's identity in this new model?
Identity is the new building material. It's grounded in things like cultural belonging, historical grievance, and the demand for symbolic recognition. It's less about a grand plan for everyone and much more about who belongs and whose story gets to be told.
And the analysts are really stressing this isn't just a new trend or a protest cycle.
No, not at all. They're calling it a structural reordering of how power itself operates. The phrase they use is a post-ideological but not post-political era. We've kind of stripped away the old organizing principle, ideology, but the fight for power, for legitimacy. It's fiercer than ever.
Okay, so to understand where we are, we have to understand where we came from. Let's look back at that ideological settlement. What held everything together in the mid-20th century?
It was a very tidy package, really. You had liberal democracy providing political legitimacy.
The political side of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then Keynesian economics was there to underwrite social stability. The idea that the state could actually manage the economy for the benefit of its citizens. And on top of that, you had multilateral institutions to manage conflict between states. These were the shared rules of the game, a kind of political grammar that constrained what was even imaginable, even during intense conflict.
So even when parties were, worlds apart on spending or regulation, they were still arguing inside a shared reality, a shared idea of how the system worked and where history was going.
Precisely. That ideological opposition was, paradoxically, stabilizing. Social Democrats might have fought for more redistribution, for example, but they weren't trying to tear down the entire capitalist system. The struggle was contained.
And then that system just hit a wall. The research all points to the 1970s. Stagnation, deindustrialization, the collapse of the Bretton Woods currency system. The whole material foundation just started to crumble.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the response to that crisis, what we often call the neoliberal turn, with all the privatization and deregulation, it wasn't sold as a big new ideology. It was framed as a technocratic response.
As a practical fix.
A practical fix, all about efficiency and market rationality. It wasn't a new vision for society. It was management.
So instead of a grand vision, it just became governance by spreadsheets.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the analysis suggests that by doing that, by prioritizing market logic, this shift thinned out ideology. It turned it into mere administration. It basically depoliticized economics.
Okay, but if you take the conflict out of economics, where does it go? It has to go somewhere, right? The sources show it was almost physically displaced.
They do, and the evidence is stunning. The scholarship shows that since about 2010, across all the advanced democracies, conflict over redistribution, who gets what slice of the economic pie, has weakened substantially. But at the same time, conflict over cultural issues, immigration, gender, race, national symbols, has just intensified dramatically. The battleground moved from the wallet to culture.
And that just sets the stage perfectly for identity to rush in and fill that void. The sources we've looked at argue this isn't an accident. It's a structural response to 4 huge converging transformations. Let's get into that first one. Economic disembedding and fragmentation. That sounds a bit academic. What does that actually mean for the average person?
It means that globalization and financialization basically severed the link between how your country's economy was doing and how you were doing. A factory could move overseas, capital could flow across the globe in an instant, and suddenly your job security felt completely disconnected from your country's GDP.
So the old solidarities, your union, maybe your workplace, they start to erode. What do people cling to then?
They look for certainty somewhere else. They find meaning and a sense of protection in ascriptive identities. Things you were born with or feel are fundamental to you, like your ethnicity, your religion, your culture. Identity becomes a substitute for the solidarity that labor and the state used to provide.
The second condition is the hollowing of political representation. So as all the parties started to agree on that spreadsheet-based governance, they stopped offering real ideological choices.
And voters felt it. The statistics on this are, frankly, shocking. There's research from Bocconi University that tracks the disappearing center in the U.S. They found that citizens who identified with low trust, anti-establishment views jumped from about 30% in the late 1980s to 50% by the mid-2000s. That narrowing of choice just bred massive distrust.
Then you have this 2025 analysis that confirms that trust in government plummeted across Western democracies. But here's the really fascinating part. We assume everyone just hates the government equally, right?
Not at all. That study, which looked at thousands of surveys, found that while trust in representative institutions, so politicians, parliaments, political parties, it dropped significantly. But trust in non-representative institutions, the police, the civil service, the parts of the state that just do things, the trust actually rose by 13 points.
Wait, hold on. So people don't distrust the state's ability to pave a road or deliver the mail. They specifically distrust the people they elect to run the state.
Exactly. It shows the crisis is deeply, deeply rooted in the political class itself, not the administrative state.
Okay, condition 3 brings us right up to the present day. Media and algorithmic amplification. The idea that digital platforms didn't just report on politics, they fundamentally changed it.
They transformed identity into a political weapon. Because the algorithms that run these platforms, they reward emotional intensity. They reward moral absolutism.
Which creates what the sources are now calling techno-affective polarization.
Yes. The system itself favors sensationalism. It pushes healthy disagreement into these binary us versus them battles. And populist leaders, from Trump to Bolsonaro, they understand this intuitively. They use these platforms to bypass traditional media, which they can then frame as just another part of the corrupt insider establishment.
And that leads to the fourth condition, the crisis of universalism. The post-war liberal promise was that universal rights would eventually make local identities less important. But globalization didn't benefit everyone equally, and that delegitimized the whole claim.
That's the key. If universalism feels like it's only working for some people, it stops feeling very universal. And that elevates demands for recognition over redistribution. This creates what the sources call an antinomian challenge.
Which is a fancy way of saying.
A fancy way of saying we now face contradictions that seem irresolvable. How do you balance universal principles, like individual rights, against the demands of a particular group for recognition, especially when they clash? Identity becomes the main currency of justice.
So we've shifted from a politics of economic competition to, well, symbolic warfare. The main struggle now is over symbolic hierarchy and moral legitimacy, not just material stuff.
And that moralizes the entire political conversation. If your political view is tied to your moral identity, then anyone who disagrees isn't just wrong, they become morally transgressive. They're seen as illegitimate or malicious, a threat.
Which in turn erodes any real sense of universalism. Rights start to feel like they depend on which group you belong to, not on a shared humanity. And we should be clear, this isn't just coming from one side.
Absolutely not. The analysis points out that populist movements, which can be rooted in things like white supremacy or misogyny, are paradoxically creating their own form of identity politics. They define who the true citizens are and then frame any claims from feminists or anti-racist groups as an existential threat to the nation itself. It's an exclusionary identity politics built to defend a perceived hierarchy.
And this brings us back to that key term that seems to define everything now, affective polarization. So if I'm getting this right, the argument is that citizens aren't necessarily more extreme in their actual policy beliefs than they were 50 years ago?
That's the crucial distinction, yes. Today's polarization is defined by the disproportionate weight of outgroup dislike. It's not about what people believe so much as it is about how they feel about the other side.
So it's less about loving your own party and more about really, really hating the opposition.
And the data on that is overwhelming. An analysis of 143 elections across 12 Western democracies found this growing prevalence of out-party hate versus in-party love over time. People feel much stronger negative emotions toward the opposing party than positive ones toward their own. That shift from ideological disagreement to pure emotional antagonism is what structurally undermines democratic stability.
Let's see this in action because the sources use an incredible case study to show how deep this runs, and it's in a place you might not expect. Climate change.
This finding is really powerful. It shows that today, your identity predicts your views on climate change more strongly than your scientific literacy, your personal experience with extreme weather, or even your direct economic interests.
That's shocking. So the question starts being, what does the science say we should do? And it becomes, what does believing this say about me and my tribe?
Exactly. It's a phenomenon called identity protective cognition. When your partisan identity is made salient, your beliefs on climate immediately shift to align with your party's position. It overrides other forms of logic. The research highlights how U.S. political rhetoric from 2016 to 2020 framed climate change almost entirely through a nationalist lens.
It became a proxy war over who the true patriot is.
Right. It wasn't about global collective action. It was about which position better strengthens American identity.
And that ties directly into the populist nationalist synthesis we see everywhere, where political elites are actively using identity for their own ends.
They fuse this anti-elite rhetoric with nationalist identity appeals. Leaders like Modi or Orban, they rely on constant crisis narratives, existential threats from immigration or crime, and they use direct communication through social media to bypass any critical filter.
Which leads to that weird institutional ambivalence they all seem to have. The rhetoric is fiery, revolutionary, but their actual governance can be surprisingly pragmatic.
Yes, there's a big bark versus bite gap. The identity mobilization is the strategy. It allows them to maintain an anti-establishment posture even while they're in power, no matter what policies they're actually implementing.
So what's the strategic cost of all this for a body like the G7?
It's huge. These domestic identity battles are now severely constraining foreign policy.
Mhm.
A 2025 analysis shows significant inconsistency and divergence among G7 and EU members because their leaders are playing to different domestic identity groups.
And authoritarian regimes must love this.
They do. Countries like China and Russia use these Western identity conflicts as powerful propaganda. They can portray liberal democracy as unstable, hypocritical, and chaotic compared to their own systems.
And at the end of the day, this kind of politics just incentivizes short-term symbolic wins that play well on a social media feed over the hard work of building durable policy coalitions. It paralyzes collective action.
Now, it's important to say the analysts emphasize that democratic collapse is not inevitable, but the challenge is finding a new synthesis. We have to integrate this new reality into a functional democratic model.
So what are the pathways? What does the research suggest could move us beyond this fragmentation?
The first is about repoliticizing the economic sphere.
Yeah.
We have to find a way to link political legitimacy back to tangible economic outcomes, not just moral signaling. Those economic grievances are still there, they're just buried under all the identity conflict. The challenge is to articulate economic visions that cut across identity divides.
The second pathway is reconstructing universalism.
And this doesn't mean forcing everyone to be the same. It means building civic identities that are inclusive without being empty. Universalism has to be rebuilt as a set of institutional frameworks that can accommodate diversity and manage that tension between shared principles and particular identities.
Okay, what's the third one?
Third is reasserting institutional mediation. We have to strengthen the institutions that can translate social conflict into negotiated outcomes instead of just performative outrage. And since trust is still relatively high in the parts of the state that actually do things, like the civil service, the focus should be on improving their performance to restore faith in the government's basic competence.
And the final pathway seems to go right to the heart of the problem. Reframing identity as a dimension, not a totality.
Exactly. We have to acknowledge that identity concerns are legitimate and real, but we can't let them become the only lens through which we see all of politics.
How do you even do that?
The research suggests that interventions that leverage superordinate identities can really help. Things like a shared national identity, or a generational identity, or even our shared humanity. These can reduce polarization without making people deny their particular identities. It's about decoupling who you are from what you believe the top tax rate should be.
So to bring this all home, this deep dive has really laid out a fundamental structural transformation. We've moved from a politics organized around competing visions for society, the age of ideology, to one organized around competing assertions of belonging. the age of identity.
And the evidence through 2025 is clear. This fragmentation is accelerating. It's structurally embedding that effective polarization, that outgroup hate, into our systems. And that makes the kind of long-term cooperative decisions needed for global governance incredibly difficult.
This really forces us to confront the defining question of our time, doesn't it? We have to find a new answer to what holds a pluralistic democracy together. The old ideological glue is gone, and this fragmented identity politics is clearly tearing at the seams.
Which leads us to the final provocative thought for you to take away from all this. The Western world, for all its problems, still holds immense power. But if it fails to find this new political synthesis, if it can't integrate these competing identities into some kind of shared project, it risks losing the capacity to know what it is even for. The transformation is already here. The only question left is whether we can find a way to bind ourselves together again before the forces of fragmentation win.